Closing comments on our topic, I would like to ask Mr. DARIUSZ ROSATI, please.
Good afternoon, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to express my thanks to the organizers who invited me not only to the conference, but also they offered me the privilege to say a few words at the end of the conference. Of course, I'm not going to give you a summary of these 2 days debates, because one reason is very prosaic. I couldn't be present at all of the panel discussions. But on the other hand, it would be definitely too demanding to give an overview and a summary of discussion which was so rich and so interesting and so far-reaching in many respects within these few minutes which I've been given. So let me perhaps give you let me share some observations with you, observations that came to my mind when I listened to this extremely interesting exchange of views. Well, first of all, let me note that the issue of EU-Russia relations is a recurrent issue that has been present in debates and discussions among European and Russian politicians and political scientists, one can say forever. There's been a spate of conferences like this one. There's been a number of symposiums and congresses during which people from both sides tried to answer the question what to do in order to get closer, what to do in order to establish durable cooperation, to remove the ghost of the past, and so on and so forth. And when we compare this enormous amount of time spent on discussions with what we achieved, we still feel quite disappointed and a bit frustrated, because the progress has been slow. And yet, before I come to the reasons which I think are quite important behind this very slow, even sometimes glacial progress of development of relations between the EU and Russia, let me perhaps tell you why I think that both the EU and Russia are somehow doomed to have very close mutual relations, and why they actually have, as we can say, condemned to each other and to stay in very close relationship. Of course, the obvious starting point is geographical proximity, but this has been always like that. This is an important factor, and for many, I would say for many people, Russia is a country which is very close to Europe, to European Union. Actually, is a European country. But in some respects, Russia is a very remote country, much more remote, I would say, than Canada or Australia. What unites us definitely, increasingly, is the economic dimension of our relations. Trade, business, investment, production. This is something which definitely is on both sides very important, especially on Russia's side. When we look at the size of mutual trade, the European Union is by far number one partner for Russia, and the total trade is about $300 billion, which is 4 or 5 times more than the bilateral trade between Russia and China. So it's still, I would say, no competition. EU is the primary area of economic expansion for Russia, and also vice versa to a large extent. I can, of course, say also about cultural affinities and a number of traditional links within broadly defined culture, including literature, music, ballet, and so on and so forth. This is something which we definitely share with each other. When we look at the alternatives that are confronted by Russia in terms of selecting its way forward, in terms of choosing its strategic partners for future, then, as I say, the EU has no rival, actually. Of course, there are some ideas of establishing a strategic partnership between Russia and China. But I think the justification for this kind of strategic partnership is much weaker. There's been some opinion expressed here during this conference that Russia's specificity is that it is a Euro-Asian power. I would say it's much more European than Asian. If I may say quite bluntly, is that although Russia indeed spans over 2 continents and indeed until Pacific coast, its presence in East Asia is minimal. And actually it has not established itself as a strong economic player in that region. Russia has gravitated more towards Europe. I would even say that Pacific coast for Russia is not a gateway to Pacific, to the US, to Japan, but rather is a natural border, a natural limit, geographical limit. So this is also an indication that perhaps there is some kind of a gravity for the Russians to come closer to Europe, rather. And also when we look at the potential shape of the strategic partnership with China, then we would see immediately that it displays some asymmetry, both in terms of economic potentials, but also in terms of certain strategic significance and strategic importance in the other part of the world. Look at the growing role of China in establishing partnership with the US in the Pacific Ocean, in the Pacific region. It's gaining more and more importance, and I think that for China that's the primary avenue for future development and for future strategy of establishing its position in that region. Another option would be for Russia to simply maintain, we can say, an equal distance from Europe and Asian powers, emerging powers, and establish some kind of a gravity center on its own, inviting perhaps other post-Soviet countries to join. And this is again not very attractive, I think. Even though there may be some ideas to try to build a Russian position as an alternative to China on the one hand and to Europe on the other hand. That would not be very effective, both because the economic potential of such a grouping would be much, much less attractive to potential members, because the total GDP of such a grouping would be probably $1.5 trillion US compared with more than 12 or 13 trillion dollars for the European Union. So that would differ by a factor of 1 to 10. But also, I think politically, Russia in that setup would somehow prevent itself from benefiting from closer cooperation with Europe. So I think, in fact, if I make liberty to make such an assessment or such an advice, is that for Russia it's practically the choice, the only choice, or the most optimal choice, I would say probably like that, is to integrate with Europe. Well, if this is really the case, if this very, very sketchy analysis is correct, then, and this can be, of course, supported by other observations, like, for instance, a clear lack of progress in the context of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which does not develop probably according to the hopes the Russian side would have in this respect, and also in the context of gradual and very quiet progress of China's influence in Central Asia. So this has all to be taken into consideration. So if this is the case, if this European choice, European alternative is indeed something which would probably be best for Russia, so what are the reasons that we are not progressing fast enough? And again, we can probably cite several historical reasons for that. Our mutual history between Europe and Russia has been quite turbulent, especially here in this country. We still keep some memories of that. But I think that this is not the case because we have, I would say, equally unhappy experiences with some other neighbors. And yet, we've been able to somehow overcome this historical problems. I think the key thing is, and it's been mentioned several times here during this conference, is this mistrust which persists between the two sides, between Europe and Russia. And this mistrust is, of course, to some extent justified, because not only history feeds this mistrust, but also, I would say, present and contemporary developments. They also, in many respects, in many instances, they actually contribute to this mistrust. What I have in mind is that there are some facts in bilateral relations which are interpreted differently by both sides. One of these facts have been mentioned here. The interruption of supplies, of oil supplies to oil refinery Możejki. That's one thing. Another is, for instance, the European Union's offer to Ukraine of signing association agreement. This offer is seen by Europe as extending the zone of stability, as giving a hand to Ukraine in the progress of reforms, right? Supporting Ukrainians in their quest for reforming their economy, making it more stable, more predictable, and more growth-oriented. On the other hand, many Russians may interpret this move in terms of this perennial strategy of encircling Russia, of the European Union encroaching into the territory which has been traditionally under Russian influence. I mean, how to resolve this problem? This is a question of perception. This is a question of interpretation. The same fact is being interpreted in completely different ways by both sides. I can cite many examples of that. Let me refer to what Minister Ivanov said yesterday. Actually, he said something which was really very striking to me. He said that he did not understand the whole idea behind the NATO expansion back in the 90s. And even now, he doesn't understand what is the reason for NATO to expand, to enlarge, given that the Cold War has finished. One could reply to that asking why to bother about NATO expansion if the Cold War is finished. But speaking seriously, I think again, NATO is interpreted in a completely different way in the West and in the East. For us, NATO is the area of stability and democracy. Minister Rotfeld just mentioned that. And that NATO enlargement is a process that contributes to Europe's stability. For Russia, and I'm ready to understand that, for Russia, it is interpreted as an advance of an alliance, of a military alliance, which used to be perceived as a threat to Russia. How we can reconcile these different opinions, how we can reconcile these interpretations. There is no easy way. And I think that in spite of the fact I mentioned at the beginning that there is a number of conferences going on this particular topic, I think this conference today is very valuable because it provides us with another step on this very long road towards reconciliation. It helps us simply to understand each other and to gradually remove this mistrust. I think that at the end of this process, at the end of the day, and this journey will be very, very long, I hope, Minister Ivanov, that someday we will all admit that we welcome NATO expansion, actually. And this will indeed mark a change of minds, a radical change of approach. Of course, what I'm saying is a hyperbole, but still it conveys the message. We should learn from each other to understand what is the interpretation of each side of simple facts that are quite obvious for one side and completely different and have completely different meaning for the other. So the key is confidence building, of course. Confidence building cannot be done overnight. This is not done by fiat. It takes time, efforts, and regular contacts. But this is something worth of undertaking, definitely. Confidence building should probably be buttressed by three actions undertaken on parallel. Right? The first one is, in order to facilitate this mutual understanding, we should probably work on approaching our institutions, broadly defined. And here I come to the issue of modernization of Russia. We would like to understand what actually is meant by modernization. Is this just that Russia wants to be able to produce more advanced space rockets, or maybe have achievements in some other sciences, or rather it is a strategy to establish the rule of law in the country and improve education or health standards? What exactly does modernization mean for the Russians? But I think if we could agree that we understand democracy in a similar way, and that we do not think that there are two different democracies, European democracy and sovereign democracy, then that would definitely allow us to get a little bit closer. If we agree that the rule of law is important, Ambassador Wukin reminded us that it's not sufficient to promulgate laws, but it is important to make sure that they are enforced. And this is exactly what's not working, actually, in many cases in Russia. So institutional rapprochement is something which I think would help us gradually to remove these different interpretations. The second thing is, of course, gradually establish common understandings of the values that are behind our societies and behind our civilizations. And again, I come back to this rule of law, democracy. Is this indeed a set of values that is shared by both sides? If yes, then why this idea of community of values that was launched by Russia and the European Union some 10 years ago has not finally flight, has failed, in fact. So perhaps we should spend some time on how do we understand the most important, the most fundamental underlying values that guide the institutional solutions in our countries. Well, I said this, of course, is not something which can be done overnight. This is going to be a long process. But let me finish with a more optimistic note. And this is something which refers to our experience, to the experience of our bilateral relations between Poland and Russia. These relations have been always quite difficult. I don't have to convince anybody in this room. However, 2 years ago, we started somehow to better understand each other. And I think the very fact that in the case of cutting, we heard important words both from Prime Minister Putin, President Medvedev, and from the Russian Duma, I remember last year. The statement by Duma last year has resonated very strongly here in Poland. And that was perhaps very symbolic. It was perhaps not realpolitik, but it has made enormous change in mutual perceptions. And I think this is an example that something can be done in spite of this very difficult historical heritage which we share. We are in a position to make progress, even in this very delicate and very controversial case of Polish-Russian relations. And I think that conferences like this one are important because they allow us to make another step. As I said, this is a long way, but still we have to progress. We have to proceed this way in order to finally, at the end, if you want indeed to come to this reconciliation, understanding, and integration between Russia and the European Union. Thank you.
Dziękuję, panie ministrze. Szanowni państwo, zbliżamy się do końca i istotnie ja wierzę również, tak jak pan powiedział, że ta konferencja była niezwykle ważna i na pewno przyczyniła się do zrozumienia, do lepszego zrozumienia wzajemnego. Szanowni państwo, w imieniu Fundacji ja chciałabym powiedzieć, że bardzo cieszy nas to, że ta ważna dyskusja odbywała się z udziałem tak wspaniałych gości i na tak wysokim poziomie odbywała się właśnie pod patronatem profesora Bronisława Geremka. Chciałabym naszym szanownym gościom bardzo serdecznie podziękować za udział w tej konferencji. Również dziękuję panom moderatorom, panu ministrowi, państwu za udział w konferencji i w dyskusji, również partnerom konferencji, których wymieniliśmy w materiałach konferencyjnych. Państwu dziękuję za udział w dyskusji i zapraszam za rok na konferencję, również we wrześniu w tym miejscu. Bardzo serdecznie dziękuję raz jeszcze.